we need a global theory. And my own view is that the economically based theories are not really adequate. We've got to go to another level of abstraction. That's not just it's not just what we think, it's how we think, and that we represent a different perspective, a different vision. That in the first instance is looking at the person who's doing the visualizing. Now, you still have to look at the reality of the world, of course, but you get a sense of we have this kind of mind, and this is the kind of mind we're going to try to not impose, but at least balance off the things like the global corporations, TPP and TIPP and so forth. TIPP is pretty dead, you know.
Really?
The European one, yeah, that
Oh,
looks
okay, I haven't
dead.
heard from that.
And I hope we can kill TPP.
What are the chances of it getting passed in the next 6 months?
It's what?
What are the chances of it getting passed in the next 6 months?
Yeah. I don't know.
So thank
Every once in a while you see a glimmer from Obama, but he's really not a visionary. He really isn't. And once in a while he'll do the right thing. He lets these nonviolent prisoners off, although nowhere near as many as he should. Okay. And what about Leonard Peltier? And there are a whole bunch of other things he could do. And he kind of tried to split the difference. And he's not a right winger, but he's certainly no more than a centrist.
Yeah, it's a political fraud.
Yeah.
Corporates.
Well, there is, you hear that people say there's a global Green Party, and that's kind of true and it kind of isn't, but there's a global Greens conference and there are Green parties around the world, and then there's kind of a network. It didn't all start, it started in 1 or 2 places, but it didn't all start, and then they were organized part of one organization, but different parties or similar parties started up in different countries. And I think it started actually in Britain. It was called like the New Values or something, and then it occurred in either Tasmania and New Zealand fight over who was first. So anyway, the Tasmania and New Zealand duke it out over who got the first elected official, but and then I think there were like Switzerland and Sweden, and then in Germany they had this big watershed that everybody knows about, and because in Germany they refer to parties by their they designate a color, and so somebody jokingly said, "Oh, they can be green," the environmental party, and so that stuck, and that's where that came out. So, but now they have there's like Ukraine, there's Taiwan, Japan. There's in several African countries. So there's in South America, and they play deal maker. They get enough to be part of the parliamentary system in their minor parties, but they can exert some force. When we were going to invade Afghanistan, the first European country that tried to pull out of it was Belgium. You think, Belgium, they always do Bhutan. But there were two Green parties. It was the Flemish and the Walloon Green Party versions of the Green Party were opposing it. They had just enough clout there to pull that out. So that's kind of what. Well, we've been known to help city council candidates win with groups this big, believe it or not. Because in Iowa City, people have won with 2 or 14 votes and stuff, and we're good at canvassing and that stuff. So yeah.
The voter turnout is that low.
And it's
Well,
16, I think I sent you.
Yeah, it was that close.
Oh.
City council can get. Right? So thank you for coming here. Well, I'm glad we did get at least a small, but more than just a couple people turnout. And I just wanted to thank Bill Kreml for coming here. As people may know, Bill Kreml is Professor Emeritus from South Carolina University, the University of South Carolina. He was author of 9 books, including the current one we'll talk about. And let's see, you were also one of Jill Stein's competitors. There were actually 5 people who were running in that race, and he came in second. And actually, of the 5 original that started, he was the only one, along with Jill Stein, who completed all of the steps to be officially recognized on our official recognition page. And he won the state of North Carolina. So thank you for coming. One more thing, just want to mention, one thing that Bill did that a lot of people don't know about was that he did a lot of petitioning. Those of you who are helping collect ballot petition signatures, which if you're a third party, you know what that is about. So Bill was in Illinois and some of these really horrific states. What was it, 40,000 in Illinois? Yeah, we had 1,500, we got over 2,000, and that was a big deal. They had to do 40,000, so we owe a big thanks to people like Bill.
Were you successful in all?
Thank you, Holly. For
Yeah, and they were, yeah.
your very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's good to have 8 of you. This is good. You're all smart people, I'm sure. And I look forward to things like this. Let me start off by saying this. I'm of Czech descent on my father's side. I'm very fond of the city of Cedar Rapids. You all know Cedar Rapids is a very large Czech and Slovak community. I've been up there, went to the museum and the little shop and bought the mug and all that kind of thing. Last night on YouTube, I looked at the 1975 version of the Heydrich shooting, the assassination of Heydrich. There is now a new movie out, as you know, of the assassination of Heydrich. But I had never seen the original one. Timothy Robbins, who we all remember from the Last Picture Show, is in this. And it's an all Czech operation, the production and so forth, all done in what was Czechoslovakia. It's an interesting place. I've been to Prague many times, and it's so forth. The reason I bring it up is not simply to talk to you about me or Cedar Rapids, but to say that those of us who study politics, okay, and I'm terribly overeducated. I have a JD from Northwestern Law School and a PhD in political science too, and from Indiana University, is that we get very involved with politics and institutions and all this kind of thing. I turned down a job at a very nice school for this fall because they wanted me to teach the Congress and the presidency. And I said, I'm sorry, I can no longer teach the Congress, okay? I'm not going to sit in front of students and say, okay, this is how a bill becomes a law. Subcommittees and hearings and committees and then votes, and then there's a reconciliation of the two if there's a difference, between the House and Senate versions. I can't teach that anymore because I know that legislation every day is inserted at the last minute, written by lobbyists, into some bill, okay, at 11 o'clock at night, that gives a tremendous tax loophole or some regulatory exemption to some, and that's how it really works, okay? So you can read Article 1 and Article 2, and that, it was a nice try, and it worked for a while, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way anymore. And I just told this very nice chair of the department, I just said, look, I can't face young people and say, oh, this is our Congress, and it works, and that. No, it doesn't work that way. The Congress is a large money laundering institution. And basically what it does is act as a broker for the magnificently large and powerful groups that are over on K Street, okay? We have been taken over. We are now an oligarchy, okay? We are no longer a constitutional democracy. Major study by some people at Princeton and Northwestern came to that conclusion. Mayor Bloomberg of New York now refers to us as an oligarchy. Jimmy Carter now refers to us as an oligarchy, okay? We lost our constitutional democracy. It doesn't exist anymore. And if you want to look at the effluent of the Republican and Democratic parties, look at their current presidential candidates, okay? I'm from Illinois, a lot of you from Illinois. I was raised with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. We're going to get to hear the Hillary-Trump debate. Boy, that's just going to be an illuminating educational activity, isn't it? All right. The reason also, though, that I mentioned the Czech ancestry is that, as all of you know, I'm sure you're all very well-educated people, in the interwar period, World War I, World War II, the only nation state that was still a constitutional democracy in all of Central Europe was Czechoslovakia. All right? Hitler was a bad guy, we all know that, but Pilsudski in Poland and Austria, Hungary, Romania, all those countries in that region of the world were highly authoritarian, totalitarian systems, okay? Some a little less brutal than Hitler, but they were no more democratic, all right? Czechoslovakia was the only democratic country in all of Central Europe, okay? Why? Well, as I started to say a minute ago, you study all the institutions, but you've got to study what at least some political scientists understand as pre-politics. What is the culture, okay? What is the history, okay? The art, the music, the literature. And if you look at the Czech Republic, you look at things like Pulaski. How many of you know who he is? If you go to Prague, please go to Prague. Okay, before you die, go to Prague. Okay? Right along the river, there is this incredible piece of statuary. It's just wrenching of this figure who is bent over and obviously in pain, you know, and trying, you can just see the tension, trying to lift something off of his back. Mid-19th century, what are you talking about? Germany and the German influence. And to free the Czech history, okay? And he was a historian, and a great historian, and he wrote the history of the Bohemian and the Moravian peoples. It was one of the things that led to the freeing of the Czechs, all right? Magnificent statue, all right? On top of that, you have the music, Smetana, Dvorak, very nationalistic music, okay? Smetana called his great piece the Moldau, but it's really the Ladova, okay? The Czech word is different from the German word, okay? And I'm just going to go through a couple more of these. If you go to Prague, go across the river going north from downtown, the Staré Metro, and you will get to the Alphonse Mucha Museum. How many of you know who Mucha was? Art, anybody? The great national artist who did something called the Slav epic. 20 huge murals, the history of the Slavic people. Overwhelming, just mind-blowing, you see, all right? The great Czech artist, all right? And of course, you know about Václav Havel, I'm sure, all right? But it goes back farther than that. Hašek, how many of you have ever read Švejk? The soldier Švejk? You read it? This magnificently ironic, satiric, of this soldier who, well, he just kind of sabotages everything by being highly literalist. They give him an order and he does it so literally that he screws it all up and he keeps getting reassigned to different positions and so forth. So you have Hašek and you have Hrabal. Go to the Kafka Museum. Great figure. And you just, his sense of freedom and so forth. But all of this leads to a political culture that's underlying the political institutions, so that people like Tomáš Masaryk, all right, and Beneš, okay, and if you know Czech, you know those names. I was a teaching assistant for Václav Beneš, who was Beneš's, the Beneš who was premier, was his nephew. Great sense of dedication and underpinning for a constitutional democracy. We will not be ruled, okay? And so whether it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Germans, or later the Russians, there is this deep underpinning of strength throughout all the various culturing systems, if you want to call it that rebel against that. There's a strong anti-authoritarian current in the Czech culture. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to suggest to you that what I'm doing is a creation. I don't think it's as great as the people I've just named, but it is a creation. There is scholarship. I greatly admire scholars, people who become an expert on Shakespeare or Chinese history or whatever the topic is. You have all kinds of people who do that kind of thing. I would like to think there's some scholarship in 9 books, yes, and they all have footnotes and have articles and chapters and speeches I've given. I'd like to think I'm a halfway decent scholar, but I'm not at Harvard. And I'm intentionally not at Harvard, not that they would hire me. I have been invited. I gave a lecture at Princeton. I'm very honored about that. And I was twice invited to be a visiting professor at the University of Peking. So I've lived 8 months of my life over breathing the beautiful air of Beijing. But anyway, so there's some scholarship there, but that's only the subflooring, okay? It really is. It's only the subflooring. What I wanted to do more than anything was to create an original political philosophy based on psychology. You all know liberal thought, okay, which is based on legal protections, right to own property and sell property and that kind of thing. You all understand that. There was this liberal underpinning. And then you have the economic underpinnings of various gradations of socialism and so forth. Right? Fine. That's important. I think we need a little bit of that always. It's time to move on. This is the 21st century. And what we really need to do now is to do what Kant asked us to do in the Copernican revolution, which was to recognize that nothing exists except as you see it, and that's idealistic thought, okay? Idealism in the sense not only that you'd like things to be better, but the fact that the mind is the principal instrument of the movement of history. Okay? From the time of Plato and Zeno and the original dialecticians, all right, all the way up through Kant, through Hegel, for about 10 years with the young Hegelians, after Hegel died in 1831, you have this classical dialectic, all right? The idealist dialectic, mind first, okay? And then what happened? Well, the Industrial Revolution came along. There was a writer named Ludwig von Feuerbach, I'm sure you've all heard of him, who wrote mostly on faith, okay, religion. That's basically what he was interested in. But he said something that turned out to be very important, at least for that time, and that was, well, let's reverse the dialectic. It's the objective world that is the principal mover of history. Okay, and what was that dialectic called? Well, it was picked up by one of the Marx brothers, okay? One of the Marx brothers picked it up and turned it into what? Not dialectical idealism, but dialectical materialism. Exactly. So we've had dialectical materialism since the early 1840s as the dominant model of how history moves, okay? I'm suggesting something. It's beginning to change. It's going back to the classical dialectic, to the idealist dialectic. And here's how I think I see it. And I'm going to just tick off a couple of things. It used to be that the Episcopalians voted conservatively because they were pretty well off, you know. And the Baptists, who were the common folk, voted for the Democrats. What's happened? It switched. It switched because the paradigm is different. The Episcopalians are talking about the rights of gays, lesbians, this kind of thing. All kinds of opening up, understanding, compassion, civil rights, women's rights, concern for working people, all that kind of thing. So that's one of the things that's happened. How many of you have read Susan Cain's book, Quiet? A very powerful book. and it talks about a recognition of what has happened in the discrimination of introverts. All right? At the Newberry Library in Chicago, I listened to Barbara Ehrenreich give a very fine speech, and she talked about the things she usually talks about, poor people and women. But she didn't stop there. About 3 or 4 minutes at the end of her speech, she started to talk about the Myers-Briggs test, okay? And how it was used in a highly discriminatory way, and that extroverts were getting special deals or being treated better in corporate situations than were introverts, okay? There are now political groups that are beginning to emerge that are psychologically based. We don't care if you're black or white, gay or straight, short or tall. None of that makes any difference. Forget your objectivity. What is your mind like? Okay? Where do you fall along Jung? Okay, you've all read Jung, all right? Introversion, extroversion. I think, all right? People like that. Something very significant happened in the year 2000, okay? Up until the year 2000, what was the principal correlate, the principal indicator of how people voted? In other words, there was one variable that, when you did your factor analysis and all this kind of mathematical stuff, what one variable was the principal telling variable about how you're going to vote? Your SES, your social and economic standing, okay? That was traditionally what it was. Were you labor or were you management? That kind of thing. Or were you sympathetic to labor or management? In 2000, that changed. It changed very dramatically, and I think that's a very important thing that hasn't been talked about enough. What is now the principal correlate? If you want to see more than any other variable how people will vote on the conservative and liberal spectrum. Anybody seen that?
Ethnicity.
No?
I feel like it might be income, but in reverse.
There has been a reverse. That's what I was mentioning with you. It's whether or not you are a regular attender of a religious service. Isn't that interesting? That is now the principal correlate. If you're a regular attender, doesn't make any difference what it is. Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Muslim, whatever. If you are a regular attender, that will tell you more than anything else. In other words, an objective variable has now been replaced by a subjective variable. Okay? And there are several other indicators now. If you look at what we call the culture wars, okay? Very little to do with where you are on the incomes strata. Okay, so that's where we are. I started my research on a theory of psychology and politics 50 years ago. Okay, I started reading for it in 1966. All right, when I was just beginning graduate school. I'm in my second half century as an academic. Let's see if I can make it all the way through. All right? And what I did was read a tremendous amount of primary sources of Hamilton and Jefferson. All right? Not secondary stuff that you see on the bookshelves, but letters, essays, speeches, okay? Primary stuff. And I laid it all out, and I said, okay, what kind of minds were these two people? These are the two greatest figures in American history when it comes to ideology. All right? Washington, Lincoln, great people, and so forth, but the greatest contributors to political ideology in this country, Hamilton and Jefferson. That's the grand divide. And everything that's happened since, yes, there are iterations and coalitions moved, but still we're talking Hamilton, Jefferson in 2016. Okay? There was a book called The Authoritarian Personality. How many of you have heard of that? You've heard of the authority, you've heard of the authority, you've heard. Good. Okay, wonderful. over 1,000 pages. After World War II, the American Jewish Congress, in league with the University of California, Berkeley, said, you know, people are studying Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini and Goering and Goebbels and all that, and that's going to be taken care of. But what we want to know is, why did so many people follow these rotten human beings? Okay? Is there a personality type that is inclined to be attracted to an authoritarian style of leadership and an authoritarian system? Okay? And the title of that book was The Authoritarian Personality. Massive research. The book is over 1,000 pages. Okay? It's over 1,000 pages. Many scales, the PEC scale, political and economic conservatism, AS scale, the anti-Semitism scale, blah, 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 all of those kind of things. The most important scale was the F scale. Does anybody want to guess? F for fascism, of course. Come on. All right? And there were a number of items in the scale. And where did you scale on that? Very important as to whether or not you would support that thing. And a number of variables came out. Need for power, need for order, the suppression of impulse, the suppression of introspection, okay? One of the things you notice about Hitler and those crowds is how anti-Freudian they were. It's all that is really, really threatening, yeah, okay? All right. It's a great work. It's still the single greatest work. If you get into the psychology and politics area, you read that first, okay? All right. Now, I read it. I was overwhelmed by it. I said, wow, you know, this is the beginnings here, if you want to have a theory. I said, you know, you can't just talk about half of the spectrum, all right? What you really want to know is there a full spectrum of certain traits? And so what I did, and it wasn't easy because the Marxists, the C.W. Adorno and that crowd, you know, they're all Marxists, laid out all what are called style variables, dogmatism, rigidity, all that kind of stuff, on the right. So they had a J-curve. Well, it wasn't really a J-curve, it was a U-curve. We all know that, okay? You have rigid people on the left and right. So I had to sort that out. I did over 1,000 interviews. I did not do all of them. Over 1,000 interviews at 5 college campuses, okay? Because I wanted to see if we could sort out what are called the construct variables, those that relate to ideology. And so my first work, Hamilton and Jefferson, was to take 8 of the variables from the authoritarian personality, read all of this primary stuff, and then grade Hamilton and Jefferson on the 8 variables. How do you think they came out? Who was the more authoritarian figure? Hamilton or Jefferson? What? Hamilton, clearly. Yes. 7 of the 8 variables, Hamilton came out as more authoritarian than Jefferson. Okay. Fascinating study. It was my master's thesis, 150 pages. It was never published, but a lot of people did read it, and it got me going. Okay? And then I said, okay, what about this other half of the spectrum? So for my doctoral dissertation, I wrote a book that is a semi-classic. It's not the New York Times list by any means. It's called The Anti-Authoritarian Personality, the other half of the spectrum, and was published by Hans J. Eysenck. How many of you know that name? The most, yeah, you know him, okay. The most cited psychologist of the 1970s and 1980s, okay? And he had a deal with Pergamon Press over in London, okay? Maxwell and that crowd, remember? And he had his series, all right? A series in experimental psychology. And he liked my dissertation, and there it is, the anti-authoritarian personality, which I think is pretty well recognized as the other half of the authoritarian spectrum. Okay? All right. Now, what are those? Those are, and I'm going to write this on the board, affect variables. read feeling. Feeling, okay? Micro, okay? Hamilton and Jefferson, all right? Macro, okay? The anti-authoritarian personality and the questionnaire that I developed and its correlations on the other side. Okay, you got me? Affect variables. Now, what's the other important psychological subcategory? Not just affect, but what? This is how you feel. We also would like to know
I think.
thinking. Exactly. Cognition. Very good. Okay? The cognitive variables. Now I'm going to tell you something. We're going to talk a little bit about Kant and Hegel. But for right now, I just want to say this. You had an argument of the finest philosophers since the Greeks about that equation, 5 plus 7 equals 12. How could anybody argue about it? That's a stupid equation. Here are the two greatest minds since the Greeks, and they can't agree on what kind of statement that is. Kant said that it was a synthetic statement, what we in everyday language would call apples and oranges. Why do you think he called it a synthetic statement? You've read the book, you should remember.
Yeah, it's because 5 and 7 are different quantities of numbers. Did I misunderstand?
All right, there are two numbers on one side of the equal sign and one on the other. Okay? The concept, well, this is clearly synthetic. Hegel came along in the next generation and said, my God, that's terrible. No, 5 plus 7 is analytic. Why?
They're all numbers.
They're all numbers. They're all the same. All right? Now, what am I interested in doing? I'm interested in building a grand theory based on psychology. Why did Kant and Hegel see 5 plus 7 equals 12 differently? Because they have very different minds. What kind of mind did Kant have? What kind of variables did he have a preference for? If he said that 5 plus 7 equals 12 is synthetic, then he must have what kind of mind? Analytic or synthetic? There's an inverseness here. But once you see it, it's very simple.
Synthetic.
No. But I'll give you one word. It's analytic. Kant had a very analytic mind, very rational, deductive, logical mind. He loved mathematics, so that's what he did. And so for him, any differentiation, even a tiny differentiation, made him call what it was synthetic. He thought all of mathematics was synthetic. Okay? Hegel obviously disagreed. But Hegel had a very speculative, abstract, conceptual, creative mind. Okay? And therefore, what does he need in order to call something synthetic? A large differentiation. He'll only call it synthetic if there's a large differentiation. And that synthetic nature, it has to do with the dialectic and the movement of history. And if you don't have the synthetic cognition, you can't move history and all that kind of thing. All right? What would be the ultimate synthetic statement? And this is me now. Hegel didn't say it. My campaign slogan, and I even had T-shirts, 5 plus blue. Okay? Think about that. That was my campaign slogan. 5 plus blue. All right? The ultimate synthetic cognition. Okay? All right. So, we have come to the idealist dialectic once again for the reasons that we've talked about earlier. We are also dealing with what I believe is happening, and that is a merger, a kind of remerger of psychology and philosophy. In all classical philosophy, starting, with Plato and Aristotle all the way through, there is some notion of human nature. Most of the time it's explicit. Whoever's writing, man is so and so. But sometimes it's merely implicit. But nonetheless, it's there. And then what happened at the beginning of the 20th century? Philosophy and psychology began to diverge. Okay? And psychology went the way of a man named Wilhelm Wundt, W-U-N-D-T, German, who began experimental psychology, okay, lab kind of stuff. And so you have people like Skinner, okay, the Skinner box, the little rat, push the button, all that kind of thing, okay. That's experimental psychology. There's nothing wrong with it. But it meant that psychology became an experimental, scientific, empirical kind of thing, okay? And that was the kind of century that the 19th century was. Whereas philosophy became far more logical, what some people call analytic philosophy, based on logic, proofs, all of that sort of thing. All right? I suggest that now there is a grand re-merging going on. And I hope I'm making a small contribution to it. We're reintroducing the notion of human nature with far better understandings of psychology back into classical philosophy. Okay? The human nature question is now coming back. All right? And finally, a third thing that's happening is that physiology is beginning to validate our sense of different personalities and different ideologies. How many of you know what the anterior cingulate cortex is? It's part of the brain. Okay? It sits on top of the corpus callosum. It's very different for different people. And those differences correlate very strongly with ideology. All right? The left mind, the liberal mind, is able to deal with more variables, but even more importantly, more different kinds of variables. Okay? Be snooty about it, liberals have more complex minds. Okay? And it's just a fact. And now we have the physiological evidence of the link of psychology with philosophy and with political ideology. This is very important. Okay? We're beginning to see that we have a range, and that range and some other ranges are very important. Excuse me. All right. So let's move on. If we've come to that, and we have micro, what about macro? All right. I am not going to drive you out of the room by telling you about probably the most difficult book that I ever wrote. Relativism in the Natural Left, published by New York University Press, 1984, which did something that I will briefly describe. If you have some background in philosophy, by all means read it. If you don't, I would say you probably should. But anyway, what it did was say this. If you look at classical philosophy, you see two grand schools. One is the rational school. Okay? Everybody knows about the rational school, which says basically there's an order to the world, and basically human beings can understand it. All right? That's basically the rational position. The skeptical position is the other position, which says there really isn't any order to the world, or at a minimum, we can't understand it. Okay? Now, here's where it gets complicated, but I'm going to try to make it as simple as I can. Within those two grand groupings, the rationalists and the skeptics, there were two subgroups. If you look at the two great rationalist thinkers, you have Plato and Aristotle. All right? What did Plato believe in? In an organic society based upon differentiations of intellect and character and so forth. The gold man, the silver man, the bronze man, all that kind of thing. and a kind of vertical, well-set organization of society generally, but also politics, in which you had philosopher kings, and then you had the guardians. You all remember that from your classical education, right? All right? But that's organic. High differentiation amongst the people in the society. Where is Aristotle different? Aristotle is a pre-democratic thinker, okay? Because he's talking about participation of a number of people. Of course, you're talking maybe 500 white males who met, downtown Athens, but still, it was the beginning, right? Okay? And the idea was that those people were interchangeable, and that many people could be the ruler. And maybe for a while, and then someone else would take, that kind of thing. It's a very different view, and essentially looked at individuals as being much more similar. Okay? Put that in with the analytic and the synthetic. On the skeptical side, you had a nasty guy, Thrasymachus. Okay? No order, because the only thing there is in the political world is power. Who has the power? If you got the power, you're going to be the ruler. If you don't, somebody else. Right? And then you had what were called the relativists, Protagoras. Man is the measure of all things. You know that expression from philosophy? Okay. Protagoras. And different people will see things differently. Heraclitus. Any of you read Heraclitus? Standing in the river. Okay? You think you're standing in one place, but in fact, the river is changing. Okay? The river's going by you, so that's relativistic. All right, now, how many of you can anticipate where I'm going? If you had two sub-schools in each of the grand schools, rationalist and skeptical, what do you think happened over time? What happened over time is amazing. It took me years to figure it out, to read about it. The two sub-schools split, okay? And how you felt about rationalism and skepticism was no longer the most important thing. Because not only did they split, but then they realigned in the cognitively compatible category, whether or not their origin was from rationalism or skepticism. In other words, through the history of philosophy, there was a fission and fusion, okay? Separation of the psychologically differentiated subfields within the grand fields, and over time, a fusion, okay? In which the cognitive position on the synthetic side and the cognitive position on the analytic side became the dominant spectrum. Now, do you want to guess what two figures were the point of fusion for both the analytics and the synthetics? Who do you think? Kant and Hegel. Okay? They come together. The two sub-schools with the realignment come together with Kant and Hegel. All right? It's really extraordinary. And, again, it took me years to figure it out and to read so much, but that's what you finally get. So now the cognitive differentiation, okay, is the basic philosophical and ideological spectrum. The cognitive differentiation. All right? Let me write that down for you. Over on the macro side, on cognitive, you have the fission fusion. All right? You with me? All right. Probably second base on a home run here. All right? What difference does all this make? Why come on a beautiful Sunday afternoon? Professor talking about this grand theory, very abstract. Why? Because it makes a difference in the various academic fields. Philosophy. Aristotle said there are three forms of government. All of you should know this. Ruled by the what?
The one, the few, and the many.
The one, the few, and the many. Okay? Ruled by the one was called what? Monarchy if it was beneficent. Tyranny if it wasn't. Okay? What about the few? Aristocracy if it's beneficent. If it's not, oligarchy. Very good. Okay. And then on the other extreme, what do you have? Constitutional democracy, or some kind of Republican representative government. Okay. But when that is somehow prostituted, okay, then what is it? Pure democracy, mob democracy. All right. Which, of course, is a perversion. Are you with me? That's the classical Aristotelian view. All right? One, a few, a many. Okay, now simple question. Simple question. What is he looking at? He's looking at the number of people who are participating. Is it Mr. Kim over in North Korea all by himself? You know? Or is it, maybe the terror? How many of you have read Victor Hugo's 1793? Ooh, that's a great book. I read it in French in an edited version because Hugo wrote a 1,000-page book, but about 150 pages. In one of my advanced French classes, we read it. Yeah, incredible. Okay, yeah, there was a kind of mob rule, after the revolution, off with their heads and all that kind of thing. Okay, all right, and this is the standard view of what governments are. But I think it has to be changed. I don't think that it's current. And the reason is this. Aristotle, quite properly, this is 2,500 years ago, so it's hard to be critical of a great figure. But he was talking about the number of people who participate in government. Okay? If we're talking cognitions, what happens to this trilogy? All right. Let me introduce you then to a very simple concept, the concept of the forms. The forms come from Plato, the Phaedo, and other places. And what you have with the forms is the difference between a can of Coke and a bottle of Coke, not a can of Pepsi and a can of Coke. Everybody with me? The Coke inside the can, regardless of whether it's Pepsi or Coke, okay? Same shape. But if you have it up on a bottle versus a can, the shape of the fluid is totally different. Why are the forms important? If we're merging psychology and philosophy, which is what I've been all about and what this lecture is all about, what do you want to know? What you want to know in cognitions is what are the preferred forms of the way you think. All of you have cognitive preferences. Wholly apart from the substance of how you feel about a particular piece of legislation or a particular candidate or political party. Before you get to that, what is your cognitive predisposition? What kind of form of things do you like? Okay? And obviously, I'm going to go back to what distinction? What's the distinction that we're using? Analytic versus synthetic. Okay? All right. Now, I'm going to make a very radical suggestion. And that is that this is out of date because of what? Well, if you have the many, and it's a reasonably good constitutional order, that has everybody participating. Okay? The one, again, is the dictatorship. And the few leading to the aristocracy, and if it's perverted, oligarchy, okay? What kind of form does the few have? What kind of relationships exist between interest groups and politicians and political structures, okay? The United States government, with all the interest groups, engaging in what are basically unimpeded contracts, okay? They call it legislation, but it's not. It's really unimpeded contracts of the fossil fuel industry, the insurance companies, Wall Street, the banks, whatever, okay, who have unimpeded contractual access to the subcommittee chairs, the committee chairs, the regulatory, okay? What kind of form is that? That shape, remember? Can, bottle. What kind of shape is that? It's purely analytic because there is no other variable. It's just a contract, okay, between the interest group and the access point, okay? Lowy up at Cornell University talked about access points, all right? Unencumbered, okay? Whereas in a constitutional democracy, which is what you hope to have, okay, you have some encumbrance. Yes, there's still going to be interest groups, and they're going to argue for their point of view. But you also have a filtration system which looks at the general good, okay? How complex is that? More or less complex than the individual interest group with his or her access point. It's more complex, isn't it? Okay. So it's more, what? Give me the word.
Synthetic.
It's more synthetic. So, in fact, what happens is, even though I have great respect for Aristotle, numbers are no longer, I argue, the most important variable. What you really want to know is the form. Well, if you want to use the word shape, I won't get excited, okay? Shape. And what does it mean? Alter this trilogy for me. Well, what's the most synthetic? Kim Jong-un. How can you be more synthetic than that? All powers are right here, okay, in my fist. And this poor son of a bitch who fell asleep during his speech. Did you see that? There's some guy during his speech, they had, their Congress, the guy was in the front row and fell asleep. Executed. All right? You did not fall asleep like Kim Jong-un. Okay? And so forth. All the powers are together. So this is the most synthetic. What is the most analytic? I call that the Aristotelian inversion. Because now the Aristotelian trilogy has been reordered. Okay? It's been reordered after 2,500 years. And that's where you are. On a philosophical spectrum. Let's talk politics for a minute. A lot of people in the Green Party take the term decentralization very seriously. And I don't disagree with them. Obviously, you don't want to over-centralize power. But what do you get with over-decentralization? Look at the American political system and think of 5 things. Separation of powers. Okay? See if my 75-year-old brain can remember all about it. Separation of powers, federalism, bicameralism, staggered elections, and Section 6, Article 1, you cannot serve in both the executive and legislative branches, right? So it's not just separation of powers institutionally, it's separation of people, okay? Which country has the most decentralized system in the world? Now we tend to look at, Hitler, Stalin, and Mr. Kim, and Mao, and, those awful people, Pol Pot, you know. But there's a trilogy, okay, and there's a trichotomy. What's the world's most decentralized political system? Come on. I just gave you the 5 variables. Right here. We have an extremist government. We are, and this sounds outrageous, but it's true. We are every bit as extremist in the form of our government as Hitler and Stalin were at the other end. Isn't that an awful thing to say? No, it's not awful if it's true, because it is. Find me another system that is more decentralized than our system. Who benefits from that decentralization? The institutions that have the most power. Thrasymachus, okay? The oil companies are more powerful than you are. And so they have what, again, Ted Lowy, Cornell, have access points, okay? Boy, do they have access points. They can get to the government any way they want. So over-decentralization can be just as crippling as over-centralization, because what do you get? You get what I call private sector tyranny. We all know about public sector tyranny. And you get private sector tyranny. And the private sector tyranny means unbalanced power relationships and therefore unbalanced access, okay, from the big interests and you and I. All right? So, that's one of the political things that is going on. Let's talk legal. Let's talk legal. Here's a question I ask people. Nobody gets it right, but don't feel bad because nobody gets it right. Okay? What is the most important issue in the American Constitution? There's one issue that is the core issue. It's more important than anything else.
Unitary versus Confederation.
What?
Unitary system versus Confederation.
Hint. Okay, I'll give you a hint. What's been the most important issue in the history of the common law for hundreds of years?
Second Amendment? That was a joke.
We look upon all these things, the First Amendment, Fifth Amendment, all these other, very important things, okay? But there's a core issue. And it's probably going to stun you because when you first think of it, you can't see it, but I'll try to help you see it. The core issue in the American Constitution is, to what extent can the contract be encumbered? To what extent can a contract, and they were talking who? Debtors and creditors. I've only agreed with Antonin Scalia on one thing. All those years, one thing. As he said, when you get right down to it, the Constitution is all about debtors and creditors. He's right. He obviously was on different sides from me, but, his depiction of it was accurate. Because in Section 10 of Article 1, there is a line that says that states may not engage in impairing the obligation of contracts. Look at the Constitution. It's 99% structural and procedural. Here are our institutions. Here's how they interact. The veto, the overriding the veto. This is how judges are appointed. It's all structural and procedural, except for a couple of little things. One, what is really something that's a statute, but they put it in the Constitution. No fiddling around with debt contracts. Creditors who've loaned money, you expect to get their money back. Who was fiddling around with debt contracts? State governments under the Articles of Confederation. And which state was the worst? Letting people off and moratoriums on the collection of contracts. Rhode Island, okay? Which state didn't show up for the Constitution? It says, there are 13 states in the Constitution. No, There weren't 13 states, there were 12 states in the Constitution. Rhode Island did not show up. Okay? Even New York, which was one of the big states, had only one member. Because the Clinton family dominated, okay? And they were the old landed gentry, and the upstarts were the Schuyler family and the Wall Street crowd. So who was the one delegate from New York? Come on, where's your $10 bill? I mean, it's a big Broadway show. I mean, tell me. He was the only guy who showed up from New York State. Because he was a Wall Street, New York City guy, not a landed gentry guy from South State. All right? But anyway, to get back to it, what the founders did is they're going to have these states, under our thumb, and they won't be able to excuse these debt contracts. There's also something in there about bankruptcy. Okay, remember the little phrase on bankruptcy. At what level are bankruptcy proceedings? At the federal level. Why? Because what were bankruptcy courts doing at the state level? That's all right, okay, forgive your debt. Bank goes, what? Okay? Holly's looking at the clock, and I pretty much want to end here. The point is, to what extent do you have an encumbrance? And I'm going to close with this one thing. The Federalists, who were pro-creditor, okay, pro-Wall Street guys and so forth, did what with the structure? They overly decentralized it, okay? Do you understand that? What was the response of the anti-Federalists? To centralize. Everybody said, the Bill of Rights stands for individual rights. No. I'm sorry, that's wrong. The Bill of Rights does not stand for individual rights. It stands for individual rights in the locus. I'm going to use two Greek terms here. Locus, the place, okay? You have right, you have right, everybody has that right, okay? But what is the purpose of the First Amendment? Why do you have freedom of speech? So you can aggregate opposition. Why is there freedom of the press, okay? What freedom to assemble? Freedom to petition. Have you ever heard of a petitioner with only one signature? No, you don't get too far with that, right? All right? And even the others, the Third Amendment on having soldiers in your home, they spy on you. The Fourth Amendment, search and seizure. Why? To see your correspondence. Who are you? Okay? Fifth Amendment, not having to testify yet. All that stuff is to protect democratic aggregation. It's the response to the Federalists. You see that? So, I will close this lecture by asking a simple question. What is the single most important term that you could use to depict the original 7 articles of the Constitution? More than anything else, more than anything in the Constitution, more than something in the Federalist Papers, anti-Federalist Papers, Madison's notes, what is the most important thing you can say about 07, as I call it, the original 7 articles? They're analytic. Okay? The top of the pyramid of knowledge, the Constitution, first 7 articles, are analytic. And the Bill of Rights is what?
Must be synthetic.
The most important thing you can say about the Bill of Rights starts at the top of the pyramid of knowledge, cognitively synthetic, to aggregate people in some kind of democratic way. All right, there's a lot more to this, but now Holly's looking at the clock, and I do want to ask questions. I thank you all for coming. 8, 9, it was a 10:30 until he couldn't take it anymore.
I didn't want to stop you, but I just wanted you to be aware because I thought you might have something more critical that you wanted to make sure to get in.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it. Oh, there's so much more I could put in. I mean, I did write 9 books, and I've got copies. This is very expensive. I don't think anybody wants to buy it. If you want to buy this and you have some philosophical background, okay. If you don't, please don't. This is my most recent, and what my wife says is my last book. She's had it. And this is the 2nd edition, okay? And you have read it, and you found it interesting?
Yes.
Okay. How interesting would you say? $15?
I only bought it for a couple dollars.
What?
I bought it for a couple dollars.
I would say it's about $15 interesting, okay? Okay? I've got some here. And we throw the autograph in free, okay? All right. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Looking towards the election.
Speak up for the old
Looking
timers.
towards the election.
Yeah.
What do you think are some of the most important things we can do now?
I think is to just utterly express our discontent. All right? In other words, we have to revolt because this is a revolting thing that's going on. I mean, those words are linked etymologically. You know, this is revolting, and we need to revolt about it. I mean, this is just horrible. My answer, of course, is to vote green. I finished second, but I endorse Jill, and I hope people will vote for Jill. But, you know, we need more puppies. I mean, that's certainly one thing. And the fact now that I see Jill and Johnson have been thrown out, but they never were in, okay? They were not led into the debate. And, you know, it's a typical catch-22. If you're not in the debate, nobody knows you. And you had to, oh, you don't have 15%. Oh, we're sorry. We've seen it 4 years. You know, I mean, it's a terrible system. We have become an oligarchy. And again, it's not just fuzzy-headed abstract professors who are saying it. You're hearing it. Mike Bloomberg is a pretty tough New York guy. He said, you know, this is no longer a constitutional democracy. As I say, Jimmy Carter, a lot of other people, a lot of scholars are writing about it. This system went down the toilet some time ago. All right? I ran for Senate in 1980. I ran against Fritz Hollings, and I called for using the bicentennial, 1987, for a review of the American constitutional order. I was very successful in the sense that Dick Strout, how many of you remember Dick Strout? Did the TRB column in the New Republic many years ago. He was the dean of American political journalists. He took a liking to me, wrote me up in the TRB column in the New Republic. Christian Science Monitor, Washington Post did something, and we aggregated some of the best minds in this country. Lloyd Cutler, who was counsel to the President of the United States, Bill Fulbright, who was the was the chief outspoken person on the Vietnam War. C. Douglas Dillon, remember C. Douglas Dillon was in both the Eisenhower and the Kennedy cabinets, became a good friend, real nice, very, very nice person. Nancy Kassebaum, okay, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, just really first-rate people from government and from the academy. We got together, we spent many hours together, and we wrote up a report on what's wrong with the system. Here's what we suggest. Cutler got a personal meeting with the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, who endorsed the 4-year term for the House of Representatives, which is one of our suggestions, because the way you screw up majoritarianism is to have a midterm election where a smaller number and more extreme people vote, and they always vote to screw the president, okay? So you don't get majoritarian government, okay? So that was one of our first recommendations, okay? 4-year term. We also endorsed getting rid of that Section 6 so that people could serve both in the cabinet, or maybe sub-cabinet, and in the Congress. This is not our idea. Woodrow Wilson, 1879, okay, wrote about that there ought to be cross memberships, okay? In other words, going somewhat to a more centralized system where there's accountability. Are the Republicans in charge? Are the Democrats in charge? The Greens? Whatever. Now, not only does the system not work, but you can't tell whose fault it is. The average citizen has a bias, but is very badly informed in this country because it's very possible to do this number, okay? And I do this number every day in front of the cameras, all right? And there's some truth to it. I don't care. There may be a Republican or a Democrat in here. Don't tell me, please. But if your party is close to, if not fully, 50% at fault. The Iraq War, Bush, terrible. Yes, but Hillary voted for it. Kerry voted for it. 60% of the Democrats voted for it. Okay. The Reagan tax cut. 1981. How did that pass? Well, all the Southern Democrats voted for it. You know, I mean, come on. where do you get the kind of accountability that you get in the parliamentary system? Strout was for parliamentary government, and he wrote some things out. And there may be other people who said, you know, in the final analysis, they have to trash this whole constitution and go to some kind of European parliamentary system. We, in our group, and again, it was a really A-list group of people, blue ribbon, we tried to split the difference of moving towards some greater centralization, some degree of accountability. Is this to your credit, or is this your fault? And we ought to be able to know that and then deal with that, you know, the next time there's an election. So those are my recommendations. It is structural, you know, don't blush, you know, it is the system, okay? But they don't want you to talk about the system. And what you have is tremendous influence from party elites and from the campaign industry, you know, who want you to concentrate on the next election, send your check, don't think any higher than that on the level of abstractions, okay? Don't think about that. Sorry, no, just think about the next election. So I'm appalled by this election, but again, I have been at this since 1980. In 1984, I entered the New Hampshire primary, ran against Mondale, and what was his name, had the boat that was small monkey business.
Oh, Gary Hart.
What was his name?
Gary Hart.
Gary Hart, yes. Okay. Now, I didn't get a lot of votes, but I was invited around, and I did forums at Bowdoin College, University of New Hampshire, Smith, places like that. So, you know, I've been at this for many, many years. The system. Yes. Anybody else, sir?
So, if we did some reform to have a party system be kind of like a zoo of major and minor parties where no party or coalition could have a government established, would that correct this bias or just throw it in favor of synthetic?
I think that it would certainly help to permit people to aggregate as a collectivity, all right, which is what the European parties do a much better job of doing, and Canada and Australia and New Zealand. They just do a much better job of facilitating aggregation, okay? And then the public can make its choice as to whether to go left or go right. I mean, that's fine, and every once in a while the conservatives will win, which horrifies my liberal friends. Well, we don't want to change anything, because what if they win? Well, it's true, because what you've had by not fixing the system is that the system, that the populace has become more extreme. Yeah, and these goofies in the Trump, I mean, these are people you don't want running your government, of course. But, I mean, you have to permit legitimate conservatives, okay, people like, let's say, Colin Powell, or people like Susan Collins, the senator from Maine. There's still a couple of sane Republicans left, not very many. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Bob Taft, you know, and Bob Taft was conservative, and he was brilliant, and he was a great patriot, and he did not insist radically on his position only. You know, he could bargain and, you know, give and take and so forth. That's fine. That kind of conservatism, you know, coming from Edmund Burke and even the early Bill Buckley, when he was sane. I think, you know, later on he had a little too much brandy, but in his early years, I think he was pretty bright, and, you know, got a man at Yale and so forth, and you know. So you have to put up with a conservative that sweeps the kitchen. Because I'm a liberal, but liberals are great at starting things, and then, you know, sometimes you have to sweep the kitchen. Some of these agencies take them a long time to get rid of the Interstate Commerce Commission. All right. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Would you say a little
Go
bit
on.
more about debt, credit, and contracts?
Yeah, as I said, I'm overeducated. My father suggested that I go to law school. You know, had to be written out of the will. So I went. And I mean, this country, and people who study politics don't like to say this, don't like to hear it. This is basically a private sector country, okay? I once ran a survey, We have a very large department down at the University of South Carolina, so we merged it with an international studies and political science. So we had over 40 people. And I went around and surveyed and I said, how many of you are familiar with the Uniform Commercial Code, the UCC? These are PhDs in political science, teaching at a state school that was not Harvard, but wasn't bad, okay? Half of them had never heard of it. Never heard of the UCC. The other half, you got answers like, well, it has something to do with business, doesn't it? You know, something like that. Yeah, it's got contracts and property and negotiable instruments and bailments and all the kinds of things you learn in law school and are the private interactions of private citizens in this country, okay? The private sector is hugely bigger than the public sector, and it's more powerful. And the rules come basically from the English common law, okay? And of course, under feudalism, everything was owned by the lord, and then ultimately by the king, you know, eminent domain, which is what they're doing to the Native Americans out here, you know, okay? I was moved out of my house as a child by a vicious right-wing corporation called Northwestern University, who threw our family and a bunch of other families out of their homes because they wanted to expand their campus, okay? I'm getting them back. It's an interesting story, but, you know, you put stuff on Facebook about Northwestern, they don't like to hear that, but that's the way it goes. But no, you know, my mother was very upset. I was upset. My brother, you know, you people are going to move, or we're going to go down to Springfield and get eminent domain. Okay, get your ass out of your house. You know, no, it was lovely. It was lovely. Northwestern University. You don't have to send your children there. All right. So you know, this system slowly evolved. Sir Henry Maine. Okay, very great. Really a great quote. The history of the Anglo-American world was the movement from status to contract. Because, you know, if you were just a serf, you didn't engage in contract. You know, you farmed and you laid up the wheat in the storehouse, and you were entitled to eat some of that, and also the protection of the walls, and, you know, that was the feudal deal. Well, slowly there were tradespeople, and there were fairs, and, you know, contract evolved in which I could sell you something myself. And then slowly that happened with real property. Okay, there's always a difference between personal property and real property, remember. You know, I could sell you a piece of land. Well, you know, if you were a serf, you couldn't sell off the piece of land that you just harvested. You didn't own it, okay? So over time, you know, and of course that led to negotiable instruments, debt contracts, okay? Shays' Rebellion, Western Massachusetts, you know, okay? Hamilton went out there and crushed it because he was on the creditor's side. But what had happened is that there were some outrageous contracts, and you know, they were enforcing these contracts and so forth. The farmers, you know, the pitchfork, and you know. So that's, you know, you have to remember that. I mean, the American system, more than anything else, is based on property and contract. You know, even more than the Constitution and the public. You know, I think of the UCC as the private constitution, the private sector constitution. As they say, half the political science professors at the University of South Carolina never heard of it, and the other half is something about business. Okay. But that's a very good question. And that argument continued because some states, and again, particularly Rhode Island, had a very strong and very democratic legislature. In effect, it had its Jacksonian Revolution, okay, before the American Revolution, okay? And because it had its Jacksonian Revolution, it had a legislature that passed very generous laws with regard to debtors, again, on bankruptcies and moratoriums and changing the terms of unfair contracts and things like that. Okay? I should point out, if you want to see the other half of that, look at the Seventh Amendment. Nobody looks at the Seventh Amendment. What is it? You know, the First Amendment, Third Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment. Nobody ever talks about the Seventh Amendment. Actually, the Seventh Amendment is very important because what does it say? Does anybody know what the Seventh Amendment says? Okay, Seventh Amendment says that once a jury makes a determination of fact, okay, that fact determination cannot be overturned by an appellate court judge, okay? Now that sounds like an abstract kind of legalism. No, it's not, because what is a jury going to be made up of? Friends of the debtors, okay? And will make a fact determination that this contract was highly unfair, and that the bargaining power of the creditor was substantially better than the bargaining power of the debtor, okay? And therefore a jury can overturn it. And once it's overturned, an appellate court judge cannot overturn that fact finding, because the anti-federalists knew who was going to be appointed to the federal judgeships.
The top cats.
Yeah, the federalists. And that's what happened. You had the Judiciary Act of 1789, and you had these lower courts, okay? Because what Article 3 says, the Supreme Court and such other courts as the Congress may provide, okay? Yeah, all right. Well, they were all Federalists. And the anti-Federalists knew they were going to be all Federalists. So we're going to preserve the fact-finding that this guy was getting screwed, all right? That's the heart of the Constitution. Nobody realized that. And that was the answer to Section 10 of Article 1, which said no impairing of the obligation of contracts. That a state couldn't do it, a state legislature, but a jury could. You see the response? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, Holly.
I didn't, I just wanted to say there may be other questions, but wanted to just mention again, and Chris, because some people weren't here, next Friday evening, starting at 8 o'clock, we're going to have a watch party at Mondo's in Coralville, and that'll be the Stein Baraka Town Hall. So it's 2nd Street, or 2nd Avenue, I guess, in Coralville, Mondo's, 8 o'clock Friday. And I would be interested in knowing also how you found out about this, just to know what was
Flyer
affected.
in the library bulletin board.
Oh, okay. Is that the same as yours too? Okay, good. All that stuff about social media, that's always a flyer. Thanks. Sorry, I also wanted to mention, Bill has copies of his book and there, but also just to help with gas, if people would like to just chip in a few bucks or something, that would be helpful too.
It's a very long walk back to Chicago, it really is. I'd like to be able to drive a car. Yes.
You could just leave money here or there, but anyway, sorry, so go back to that. I thought there might have been another question.
Here's your mark.
Oh, thank you.
All right, anybody else?
Psychology also involves emotion.
Absolutely, well, that's affect, but yes, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm very curious what you would say about the psychology of the election this year.
You mean as a kind of an aggregate?
Yes, yes.
Well, I don't think there's any question that the American people are getting more disgusted. Now, that's not a terribly intellectual answer, but I mean, I think they know that something's wrong, okay? Even at fairly low levels of education and low levels of participation, most Americans now know that it's not working.
The personality characteristics of authoritarian, seems to be very much what Trump can attract. I've been concerned, we get on Trump a lot, but what does that really speak about as that the American people got him where it got him?
Yeah. Well, I think I know where you're going. I'm wholly unsympathetic with the views of the Trump people, too. On the other hand, to be fair, there is a kind of underclass in this country.
Absolutely.
And it has not been heard.
Right.
And it has had a lot of anger building up for a long time. And so someone who is clever, you're going to give Trump to, pierce the boil here. And, okay. And I hate to say it, but I mean, some of what they're saying, when you get away from all the racist stuff and the Muslims and the Mexicans and all that, some of what they're saying economically has more than a grain of truth to it,
The thing that perplexes me is he's ripped off so many working class people.
Absolutely.
I don't
Absolutely.
get that.
No. Trump would have gotten nowhere, with running against Franklin Roosevelt. He just wouldn't.
So I think there's a real psychology there. I'm a psychologist, so
okay, go ahead. Yeah, fine. Yeah.
And I wonder about the shadow, the disowned parts of ourselves that we project onto our candidates, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I often think that part of anger is not necessarily the issue per se, but not being heard.
Yes, well, I agree. No, the anger comes from that, but
Yeah,
it's not,
right.
it's not the core. I agree.
And the fear base. And I think we look to our leaders as they're going to, it's almost like be a father figure or mother figure, rescuer. They're going to do it all, but the fact of the matter is they can't do a lot of anything unless there's other things going along with them, such as cooperation with the other bodies in government. But we project so much onto them in terms of what they're going to be able
Yeah.
to do, and
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know that we think about that very deeply in terms of that psychology.
Right. Well, I think with this underclass, it's not as intellectual as you put it, because, you obviously, as a psychologist, understand it at a different level. But, again, it's been a long time since they made any progress.
Right.
People like to think that, I work hard, but when I get to age 60 or something, I've got a house that I own and a car that runs, and, the fact of the matter is that we've had virtual stagnation of working class income since about 73, 74. And that's been it. I mean, if you made so much then, you're lucky. Some people have had a substantial decline, and we have never had a full recovery from what happened in 2008. And so you've got a lot of people, particularly in the lower income groups and the minority populations, that they're taking jobs flipping burgers. I mean, that's all that's left. And so there's a kind of a downgrading. And if you look at the cross-national data on the differentiations of CEOs and factory line workers, I mean, it's just hugely greater in this country than it is in other countries. And my friends on the kind of old left, the economic left, well, it's all economic, it's deeper than that. Read John Stuart Mill on that. He talked about it as an example of culture. And we have, as you know, as a psychologist, we have a hyper-individualistic, hyper-competitive country. And it's kind of, rolling the dice, winner takes all, and it's a very different culture than what you have in Europe. And so you have, what is it, 300s? I've seen even 350 as the figure of how much more the CEO makes than the person working on it.
So I'd be curious who writes about that, who integrates the psychology with politics?
Well, I think there are a number of people who are saying, that there's an anger there. And who does now, it's hard to put a finger on it. I like what's called the EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, which is Jared Bernstein, who used to be an advisor to Obama. And although what he writes about principally is economics, to answer your question, there's an undercurrent of psychology to it. He understands that there's this frustration and that there are real costs. And the costs are not just economic. I mean, it's breaking up marriages. It's leading to alcoholism, suicide. The whole 9 yards. And I think Bernstein's very, very good about that. I just really do. There are other writers. Barbara Ehrenreich is doing a wonderful job. I think she's great. She really is. And there are other people who are now talking about it. Do you read The Nation?
No.
Well, The Nation, names aren't coming to me here, right? But there are a bunch of people who write for The Nation who are very good. Very, very good.
I think it's very interesting, getting more and more hot all the time.
The New Republic used to be good, but then it was taken over by the Israeli lobby, and all they want to do is bash Palestinians now. But no, those are just a couple names that come to my mind. But take a look at The Nation. They've got people who wrote. Alexander Cockburn, who I think has now passed away. Just passed away. But he wrote for many years on it. That was very good. So, those are people. There's what's the guy's name? They have a place, I gave a presentation many years ago up at DuPont Circle. Institute for Policy Studies, Raskin, Marcus Raskin. Now, he's mostly interested in international stuff, but there's some psychology in Raskin. And now his son ran for Congress, something. I didn't spend a lot of time watching it, but his son ran for office, and I think. Well, thanks to all of you. Any contributions gratefully received. And again, anybody wants to buy the book, it is a mere $15, cheap at half the price. Really. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.